Okay, so we've talked a couple of times today about the Whitebark Pine survey that the foundation has conducted over the past couple of months. Julie Shamart with the foundation's here to talk about the survey, run through the results. We're looking forward to your thoughts. Welcome, Julie.
All right, can everyone hear me? Great. Well, I will try to keep that the way it is. So my name is Julie Shamhart. I'm the executive assistant for the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. I know a lot of you through email, not by face. But if you don't know me through email, you can become my email friend for the bargain price of $45 at the table right outside. And you can actually sign up for our email list for free if you don't want to join as well. But we would encourage you to do that. Okay, we're moving ahead, it looks like. Yeah, it looks like my slideshow is going without me. So I'm here today to talk about the Whitebark Pine survey that we conducted this fall, set up by Diana and Bob and Eric and some other folks, the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation and American Forests. I'm going to be giving some results that came in, some preliminary results. Let's go back a second. Can I do that? Nope. Oh, I have it upside down. Okay, well. It's going to be hard for me to give you survey results without any visuals at all, because I have a lot of numbers. All right. Okay, great. And I've got it right side up now, I think. Our survey went up this fall in August and was up until mid-October. And if you haven't had a chance to take the survey, we are planning to put it back up, and you can get a hold of me and we can send you a link to it. But the objectives of our survey were basically to identify what data is currently available on whitebark pine habitat and health. We also wanted to identify some gaps, both geographically and by agency, in that data, and develop a better understanding of what resources are needed to fill those gaps in the data. We also would like to expand our knowledge of the resources that needed to meet restoration goals. So this is just a general idea of what our response data looked like. We had 66 people take the survey. A lot of those folks were from the Forest Service. We also had pretty good response from BLM and from the Park Service. And then a few other folks as well. And I will talk about that a bit more in a second. Just geographically, I'm going to walk through kind of where our data came from. That pink diagonal lines throughout all my maps is whitebark pine habitat from the 2014 Whitebark Pine Habitat Range. So that is BLM land. I did this individually by agency because it was really hard to see when you put all of the different agencies on top of one another. You can see there's a lot of overlap with BLM, or I guess most of the BLM overlap is in this area, according to our maps anyway. So the area that turns bright green is the area that we had coverage for in the survey. So we didn't have any response from this area further south, but all up in Oregon, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, we had at least some response. That's variable. We had some BLM state foresters, and we had some field office foresters as well, so at different levels. That is all the Park Service land. And that is where we had responses. So pretty much everywhere within the Park Service where there is whitebark pine habitat, we had someone take the survey at least. Forest Service was a little more complicated, or a lot more complicated. So we had some response from at least someone from that general coverage area. It varied quite a bit with the Forest Service, anywhere from technicians on a forest to regional foresters and regional geneticists. So quite a bit of variation there. One thing keep in mind, so here in a little while I'm going to tell you that we had 95% of people that took our survey had habitat data. People that didn't have habitat data probably aren't going to take our survey because those people probably don't have whitebark pine on their radar quite as much. So just keep in mind, our survey was oriented toward people who were interested in whitebark pine. That wasn't necessarily our goal, but it was a voluntary response. We did get low representation from some agencies. I think that's due in part because we didn't have as good a contacts in some of the agencies. Our targets through in the tribal areas, we only got one response from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I think we can try to outreach a bit better. I know that there's some Salish Kootenai folks here, so if you folks would like to take our survey or help us with outreach, we would certainly welcome that. So data coverage is variable within responses. So what I mean by that is you might see, you might get a big chunk of coverage from one person if I got a regional forester take a survey. So differences in responses between those folks. And then there might be some overlap in areas. I didn't get a chance to go through and, like, if I had 3 people from one forest all take the survey, you're going to get all 3 responses from that one small area. And then a lot fewer responses from some other areas. Also, some of the answers, I'm going to give you a bunch of quantitative data. There's a lot of area for qualitative interpretation in some of those answers. So things like, how good is the coverage in your area? You could say it's mostly known. Mostly known is a pretty wide, there's a pretty wide variation in what you might mean by that. So as far as management guidelines, we asked if administrative units have restoration management guidelines or guides for whitebark pine. Those are just pure numbers. 67% of respondents either have guidelines or those are being developed on their area of their area of coverage. Looking at habitat data, 95% of these people that responded had some data showing where whitebark pine is present. 67% of that data is mostly known, and another 25% is incompletely known. So only 8% of people said that they had data, habitat data within their area that was not well known. Broke that down by agency. The Park Service definitely said that they had the most data that was mostly known. Like I said, that what you mean by mostly known is open to interpretation. But the Forest Service and BLM were fairly similar. Forest Service had a little bit more mostly known and then a little bit not well known. What that data looked like. So our goal is to build a GIS map. So we wanted to know who had GIS layers or georeference points. People could pick multiple answers to this question. So obviously that adds up to more than 100%. But 90% of folks had GIS layers, or 89%, I guess. So quite a few GIS layers out there. Would you be able to share that data with us? 69% of people said yes, and another 25% said maybe. So most people would be able to or would be willing to try to get that data to us. Only 6% said no way. And then people who were able to fill those gaps. So we're looking at if either with or without resources, do you think you could fill gaps in habitat distribution, whitebark pine distribution data during the 2018 field season? And most folks either could fill that data with resources or maybe could fill it without resources. Only 3% said, nope, can't do it. We looked at some similar questions with health data. 86% of respondents had some data on whitebark pine health within their area. 78% of those had both whitebark pine or white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle. And then a few folks had one or the other. So 6% had blister rust and not pine beetle, and 2% had pine beetle but not blister rust. So most people had something. We also asked if folks knew where the areas within their area of oversight, if they knew where the healthiest whitebark pine was, and if they knew where the unhealthiest whitebark pine was. That was 2 separate questions, but the percentage was essentially the same. 34% did not know either of those things. 54% of health data was mostly known, so a little bit lower on the mostly known for health data than for the distribution data. Another 39% was incompletely known, and then only 7% not well known. Similar for the Park Service, it was about 93% mostly known for both questions. A little lower mostly known on Forest Service and for the BLM. But all of them, everybody said pretty low rates of not well known for both health data and distribution data. And here, this is just what those data look like. Again, health data, quite a bit fewer on the GS layers, but we still have 51% have those, and another 43 have georeference plots. And then those other numbers kind of varied in the comments, and anything from in my head to a whole host of other things that people said about that. Would they be willing to retrieve and share that data? That, again, is a little lower than with distribution data. 49% people said, yeah, sure. And then a whole lot more maybes. So it was, 90%, something like that? And could you fill those gaps? Still, most people either could with resources or could potentially without resources fill those gaps. Only 3% said, nope, can't do it. We also wanted to look at restoration. So 88% of the respondents to the survey have implemented or considered whitebark pine restoration in their area of oversight. 84% of those people could show us on a map where they had implemented or considered implementing restoration. Only 25% of respondents have included mitigation for climate change in restoration activities. The climate change guidelines from Keene et al. Have just come out in 2017, so we're hoping that that will increase in the future. But right now, only 25% have included it. So we had a list of restoration activities, looking at the different activities people had done. The largest thing on there was cone collections, which is 95%, and then down to protecting plus trees, thinning, planting resistant trees. Then some people planting trees with unknown resistance, commercial thinning, seed orchard, establishment, and a few other things as well. So we also asked, what would you need to be more likely to implement restoration projects? The largest thing by far was better resources. In comments, we had a lot of people say that they needed money to implement more restoration projects. A lot of people also need time, so more personnel or more time to work on restoration projects. So technical support, nearly 50%. And then several people also needed info on whitebark pine health and info on distribution. So almost a third of people on both of those. And the next panel that's coming up is going to talk about wilderness. I'm just going to touch on it real quick with regards to our survey. So this yellow stuff is wilderness. You can see there's a whole lot of overlap between wilderness and whitebark pine habitat. 82% of people that responded to our survey think that we should restore unhealthy whitebark pine communities in wilderness areas. We also broke that down by agency, and pretty much across the boards, at least 75%, and up to 86% in the Park Service think that we should be restoring unhealthy whitebark pine. So if you take homes, because that was a lot of numbers that I just threw at you, 95% of people had whitebark pine data. Those are people that took our survey. With resources, at least 62% could fill those data gaps in the 2018 field season, with another 34% saying that they could or maybe could. 86% of people had whitebark pine health data, and 60% said that they could fill those gaps with resources. Another 37% could or maybe could. 34% of respondents do not know where whitebark pine is healthiest or the most unhealthy in their area of oversight. 88% have implemented or considered restoration. Only 25% have included mitigation for climate change. And 82% support restoration in wilderness. This was funded by the Forest Service funding. The survey was developed by Diane, Tom Back, Bob Keene, Eric Sprague, Glenda Scott, David Quasi. And a whole lot of people helped us get the survey distributed. And I also want to thank everyone that took the survey. I know a lot of you here have. If you'd like to take the survey, you can contact me. That is my email address. Or you can find me out at the table, the Whitebark Pine Foundation table, and get in touch with me that way. And if anyone has questions about the survey, I can answer those real quick, maybe, if we have time. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, great microphone. So I had a question, because you were talking about, and maybe you said this before, I'm sorry I was running in late, but people not willing to share the information. Did they say why not? I mean, I know. Oh, go ahead.
There are comments on all of those answers. I think that it's because often they're just not accessible within. I think we asked within given a month or two lead. I think often it wasn't just that they don't want to share it. It's more difficult to access. These are preliminary results, so I don't know the details of all the comments. I just sort of glanced through them. I mean, I think I've read them all really quickly, but I can't give you details on all those comments. But I don't remember any of them saying, like, we don't want to share our data. I think it's just more an access issue. Anyone else have questions about the survey? All right, thanks a lot.
And now for what you've all been waiting for. Good afternoon. I am Rebecca Turner. I'm the Senior Director of Programs and Policy at American Forests. And it's truly an honor to be here, to have such a wide range of expertise in this room dedicated to restoring this iconic and important issue. This panel will begin to explore the questions of restoring whitebark pine in federally designated wilderness areas, the if, when, and how. There is a rich debate of whether any form of restoration is considered trammeling in wilderness. And while there are valid points on all sides, we will only touch briefly on these points, but delve more quickly into what needs to be considered when determining whether or not restoration of whitebark pine should occur in the wilderness area under your management. With the survey results, I realized it was a self-selection. We're looking more into what do you need to consider rather than the philosophical debate. I think it's safe to say, oh, I'm in charge. I was just gonna roll my finger at you, Justin. I think it's safe to say that we are here in this room and in our chosen professions because we value the wild, the natural, the desire of immersing ourselves in nature. We connect to the wilderness and instinctively understand both the tangible and intangible qualities. It is more than merely the biological resources. Wilderness character is about allowing natural processes to operate. Wilderness advocates ascribe values to wilderness as a specific place, an experience, a symbol, and a resource. Direct values are those gained from firsthand contact with wilderness, or experiential values, recreation, for example. Another is education, as when one learns about biology, ecology, or geology directly through observation of and the interaction with wilderness features and systems. Experiential wilderness qualities cover a wide gamut of potential benefits. One person might be seeking the challenge of navigating and traveling in a wilderness setting as a test of physical and cognitive skill. Another may have no more goal than to spend time in wilderness with whatever may come in terms of adventure, scenery, and other experiences. Indirect values are those not contingent on, though often related to, direct experiences of wilderness. The knowledge that wilderness will be around for your descendants to enjoy is bequest value, while option value describes the opportunity for one to both directly and indirectly benefit from wilderness in the future. The intrinsic value of wilderness is that beyond any human evaluation or connection, it is wilderness for wilderness' sake. Congress attempted to codify these values as best it could with the Wilderness Act of 1964. The Wilderness Act defines the wild being untrammeled by man and retaining primeval character of the land. However, it does not explicitly state that human intervention is outright barred. Instead, it leaves the door open to management in inserting that the area should be protected and managed to preserve its natural conditions and generally appear to have been affected primarily by the forces of nature, where human intervention is substantially unnoticeable. It recognizes that there may need to be intervention to maintain that primeval character. In Section 4B and C of the Act, it specifically lays out management parameters, indicating no permanent roads and structures, except as necessary to meet minimum requirements for the administration of this area for the purpose of this act. As many of you in this room whose charges is just this know all too well this paradox. Much has been written on this topic. The twin charges of to maintain an untrammeled landscape and to manage for natural conditions often conflict when areas are degraded and ecological restoration is required. Whether an area is trammeled depends on the duration, the spatial extent, and the impact of the human activities. Many management projects involve controlling an area. As a result, some see a tension between the constraints on human activity associated with wilderness and traditional land management activities. This has been termed the paradox of the wilderness management. As stated in the Wilderness Act, federal agencies are mandated to preserve wilderness character and to manage for public opportunities for recreation, scenic, scientific, educational, conservation, and historic uses. Interpretation of how to do that is rarely straightforward. Management decisions often conflict between different values such as recreation, conservation of native species compositions, or preservation of wild, autonomous nature. In some cases, leaving an area alone to maximize the untrammeled qualities of wilderness can lead to a loss of ecologically important species, whereas restoring it to a former condition in the name of conservation may save species but compromises wildness. Since the Wilderness Act imposes a duty to manage wilderness, it cannot be saying that all managed constitutes a trammel. Consequently, ecological restoration does not always create a paradox. When managers cannot jointly satisfy the naturalness and wildness conditions in a wilderness restoration project, they must either compromise both aims or pursue one in the detriment of the other. Both wilderness and naturalness are matters of degree, and there are no clear thresholds where a certain degree of control between a trammel or a degree of human alteration makes an ecosystem unnatural. In lieu of that, we are left doing our best to balance these twin mandates. So why do we care? Well, we know. We know why we care. Realizing that there is no place on Earth that has not been impacted by humans in some way. Letting nature take its course to evolve as it will. Works in some cases, but not for whitebark pine. Today, we have roughly 40% of the U.S. whitebark range occurs in wilderness areas, a quarter of which have blister rust infection rates of over 50%, and in some regions, as you all well know, these stats are much higher. Some degree of human intervention will be needed to restore these populations and preserve the natural conditions. The question becomes how to determine if some form of management is warranted, when management needs to take place, and how to go about that process. Lucky for us, our panelists have been thinking about this for quite some time. I know I put your pictures up in case you didn't need to recognize who each other were. So Travis Belote has served as a research ecologist in the Northern Rockies office of the Wilderness Society in Bozeman. His research focuses on understanding the basic science of ecosystems to inform conservation and adaptive management under increasing pressures of global change. Recently, his work has used large-scale spatial data to map wildland values and climate change vulnerability to guide conservation strategies. He completed his MS at the University of Tennessee, his PhD at Virginia Tech, and conducted postdoctoral research with USGS in Flagstaff, Arizona. Beth Hahn is an ecologist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. Her research interests are generally focused around the ecological issues related to wilderness stewardship at multiple spatial scales, with emphasis on ecological restoration, wildlife, climate change, disturbance ecology. In addition to her work at the Institute, Beth worked as the regional wildlife ecologist for the Northern Region of the Forest Service. Beth received her BA in physical geography from Boston University and her PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology and resource ecology and management from the University of Michigan. Please join me in welcoming them.
Yeah. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for coming. I guess we can't do anything about those lights, can we? That's all right. So, I work for the Wilderness Society and get asked a lot of times in many contexts, oh, is this working? Ah, okay. Okay. So I work for the Wilderness Society, get asked a lot of times in many contexts, well, what are, you're a wilderness guy, what should we do about whitebark? And I always say, I don't know. And so, but there are some things we can think about. And so basically I'm going to walk you through the things that we think about, especially at the Wilderness Society, when asked that question. And sometimes it's casual and informal, and sometimes it's, this forest manager wants to do whitebark. Should we support this publicly? Should we have a media campaign around it? How should we deal with this? And we get asked as a scientist of the Wilderness Society, what should we do? So these are the kinds of things we think about. The title, Should Guardians Ever Garden? If you don't know, that may be so cliche that you know where I'm coming from on that, but it comes from this quote from Howard Zahniser, who was the main author of the Wilderness Act, and he said, with regard to areas of wilderness, we should be guardians, not gardeners. And you hear that, I hear that quite a bit. It's almost become so cliche about, well, what should we do about whitebark and wilderness? And we should be guardians, not gardeners. I mean, that's sometimes the reaction you get. So sort of with that, kind of there's a knee-jerk reaction about what we should do about whitebark and wilderness. And sometimes it comes from these sort of, inspirational quotes about being a guardian. And what does it mean to be a guardian? What does it mean to be a gardener? Should guardians ever do any guardian to be a guardian? Again, the things we think about. So I'm going to walk you through the qualities of wildness, at least from our perspective. Kind of a simple conceptual framework that my boss, Greg Applett, who some of you all may know, developed when he thinks about what's sort of the essence of wildness. What does wilderness protect? Wilderness aims to protect wildness. What are the qualities of wildness? and how do we think about the challenge of global change, invasive species, with respect to qualities of wildness. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit of a data exercise we did, just to give us a kind of a library of data to draw from when asked that question: should we support this project? This forest manager wants a letter. Should we support it or not? We did a little bit of poking around some data to get a sense of some what are the patterns of wilderness whitebark, and what is expectation with respect to climate change. And then sort of our perspective on this dilemma that Becky set up. So wildness and wilderness, again, this conceptual framework. So what is wildness? Greg did a great review in the Denver Law Review back in the 90s, where he looked at law and looked at sort of wilderness philosophers and said it really boils down to two axes, two orthogonal axes, so two independent axes, and that's ecological condition on the x-axis. So you can imagine any place, any ecosystem ranges a gradient from novel or really degraded to pristine, and we might be able to go out there and characterize an ecosystem based on some value of its ecological condition. Is it novel, is it degraded, or is it pristine? Orthogonal to that, so independent of that, is freedom from control. So this is the untrammeledness quality. So going from trammeled, completely manipulated, completely controlled, to completely uncontrolled, so complete free will nature where processes are totally uninterrupted or there's no intervention with humans into processes. So combining sort of ecological condition and freedom from control lead to the quality of wildness. And so you can then classify along those two gradients places as sort of wilderness, this is really high wilderness character lands, to non-wilderness wildlands, to semi-wildlands, to the WUI, the wildland-urban interface, and then all the way to the built environment. So any place on Earth you can go and evaluate these things. You can potentially quantify them and sort of compare them in a relative sense and start to take that classification and say, where does this place fall within these two axes of wildness? So in Greg's original piece, he sort of took a shot at giving some examples of sort of central concepts of different places in this two axes. And so down or up, sort of simply the pristine, let's see, let me get the pointer to work. Where's the pointer on this thing? Okay, cool. So up here in this top corner, not surprisingly, are places that are high ecological integrity, what we might consider pristine, and untrammeled, so free, so self-willed nature, no interventions, like someplace like the Arctic Refuge. Down here in this corner where we have, high ecological integrity, a place that has all the species that we may expect, at least from a vegetation perspective, but it's completely controlled. And so the Curtis Prairie on the University of Wisconsin's Arboretum is a place where for 100 years, we, as in humans, have been weeding, burning, planting to try to restore a native functioning a prairie system. It's completely controlled. It requires management intervention, heavy energy inputs into the system with the goal of maintaining a pristine ecological condition. On the other end of the corner here, you have a C&O Canal where you have a completely novel, chock full of invasive species ecosystem, but it's relatively untrammeled, and so the managers aren't doing anything about it, but it's a novel ecosystem that's composed of invasive species and species that shouldn't be there, quote unquote. Down here in the corner, of course, where you have a complete novel system and controlled is downtown, someplace where it's completely degraded and it's completely controlled. And then sort of fill in places here. There's a few other examples I won't go into. But the point is that those qualities of wildness, ecological condition, and untrammeledness or freedom from control give us a framework to start thinking about different places and how we respond or how we think through when somebody asks, what should we do about whitebark and wilderness? These are the places that we go mentally. It's sort of a philosophical overlay. So a few years ago, Greg published this chapter where he said, this sort of challenge of global change is a challenge of the fact that we're sort of presented with this dilemma of the trade-off between maintaining ecological condition and maintaining untrammeled places on the landscape. So the pressure of global change is along this axis. So climate change, invasive species, pollution, fragmentation are degrading the ecological condition. So when I mean that, it's degrading or pushing ecosystems outside of historical or natural range of variability. And so we are sort of presented with options then. So take a place that, that circle right there is a place that has some level of ecological condition, some level of trammelness. And we can decide that we want to increase, given this sort of the vector of doom, as Greg calls it, that's pushing along this axis, we can decide that we want to put energy into an ecosystem and push it to try to trammel it somewhat, and then potentially, hopefully, let it go and let the system recover. So if we do some thinning in ponderosa pine, maybe we can restore fire regimes. If we reestablish predator-prey relationships, maybe the system will recover. We have to put some energy into it. We have to trammel the system, but hopefully there'll be some sort of response and recovery of the ecosystem. In some cases, we may actually have to, like the Curtis Prairie example, continue to press the system. So we have to stay on it. We have to continue to sort of put management energy into a place to maintain that ecological condition, that pristine condition, especially in the face of climate change. So that's going to require, there is no recovery in a situation. It may require that we just stay on it. There may be situations where we accept change and accept the novelty, the novel ecosystem idea. So we can say, you know what, we value untrammeledness, we're just going to let nature figure it out. If it gets completely composed of novel species, and then we're going to accept that. So that's sort of what you just saw the ball move in that direction. That may be that example. And then there may be situations where let's just stop messing with it, and maybe we can have some recovery. You know, maybe do better range management. We can have some of the native grasses come back in. So there's all sorts of ways that systems can respond to, in this sort of ecologically, to management intervention, both in removing intervention as also applying intervention. Again, so with climate change, you have this sort of vector pushing on the ecological condition. And this is, I would argue, this is probably, maybe you all would argue too. Whitebark pine is a great example because high elevation, relatively pristine ecosystems, and yet climate change, blister rust, fire exclusion has sort of pushed these systems to a more novel state. And so, do we accept that change? Do we let those systems degrade because we value untrammeledness? We want to maintain this quality here. We want to maintain untrammeledness, which is where the system was, but maybe at the expense of having a more degraded, a novel system that developed in those places. So again, that's our conceptual framework that we use when somebody asks us any of these questions. That's where I go and start thinking about, like, where would we plot this in the two-dimensional axes, and how do we think through this? So the next portion here is this sort of data dig that we did. Again, just to have some resources in our back pocket to ask questions about, well, what do the data say about where whitebark is with respect to wilderness? Where might it be, and what might be the impacts of climate change? And so we used some data that Jerry Rayfeld and Nick Crookston made available. They did a ton of climate envelope modeling for biomes and different species in the West. So we took those data, bioclimatic envelope models for whitebark pine, brought it in, did a few things to it, which is what you see here. The black areas are the bioclimatic envelope of whitebark pine's distribution. Did a simple overlay with the U.S. wilderness system, and basically asked, and I think Becky already showed this, and you maybe have already talked about it today, how much of the distribution of whitebark pine with respect to its climate envelope. So there may be individuals outside that climate envelope, but like the climate models currently, where does it predict whitebark should be, and then how much of that distribution is in wilderness? And we found 39%, which I think, and we were glad to see that because it matched a couple of other people that have published on how much of whitebark's in wilderness, is about 40%. So we're right in that ballpark. But then we asked, well, how much of the climate distribution of whitebark in the future is going to be in wilderness? First of all, what's the story? What's going to happen to the bioclimatic envelope of whitebark pine in the future? So we took the 2055 projections and then used a bunch of different global climate models that were made available by Jerry and Nick. And so this is what the results are. Basically, here's current. So that's the current distribution of the bioclimatic envelope of whitebark. And then under a bunch of different emission scenarios, which are the B1s and A2s, and A1B, and then the different GCMs that were made available. We basically just pulled whatever they had available. These are a little bit dated at this point. But to look to see, well, first of all, what's going on with whitebark? And if you see how much of the black area, there's going to be a huge reduction, at least based on these models, in the bioclimatic envelope of whitebark. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to have full-on mortality, no regeneration, but it just means that the climate, based on the models, is shifting outside of what's currently occupied by whitebark pine. And then we said we took those different black areas, the areas that are predicted to have whitebark bioclimatic, had that climate happy space, I say, and said how much of the future is going to be in wilderness. So the red numbers here represent those. So here's the 39%, that's the 40% currently. And then in the future, so 68, anywhere from 99% of what's left of Whitebark's climate happy space is going to be in wilderness, or to the best case scenario is 68%. So what do we do with that? It was just us kind of scratching the surface, say like, if we keep getting this question about Whitebark pine, we need to know a little bit about what the data are telling us. One of the things we also looked at, this is just a fun little animation, is you think about the shift of the distribution of whitebark. We also mapped where the disappearing climate happy space is, and I know that's totally unsophisticated, but that's the way I think about what these bioclimatic envelopes are telling us. So where the disappearing space, where's the stable space, and where's the novel space? So where is the climate going to move where it doesn't currently occur? Where's the happy space, of whitebark in the future going to occur? That's the novel places not currently, but is likely to be in the future. Where's the disappearing places, and then where is it stable? And so these maps show basically this Venn diagram. Here's the disappearing, here's the stable, and here's the novel. And basically the stable and the novel overwhelmingly are in wilderness also. So whitebark's heavily occupied in wilderness and will be in the future. So our perspective on, okay, what do you think? I say, I don't know. Well, that's not good enough. Tell me something. We at least thought through this a little bit and said, 40%'s in wilderness. Well, that means 60%'s outside of wilderness. We value, the Wilderness Act, American citizens value nature, self-willed nature. Let's try to find places outside of wilderness first. Look for opportunities outside first. Now, that's not always the option. The first time we got presented with this was the issue of doing restoration in the Pasayten wilderness. And we actually took these data and we said, you know what, there aren't any other options for that. And maybe some of you all are in the audience here, but there aren't any other options. So yeah, let's support that because they've looked, we've looked, there are no opportunities outside of wilderness in that national forest. But if there are no opportunities outside of wilderness exist, at least consider, be intentional, be thoughtful about the trade-off between management interventions and ecological conditions. So to acknowledge that untrammeledness is a quality of wilderness that we value, but maybe not at the expense of letting ecosystems become novel and losing these foundation species like whitebark pine. And so we said, put a little piece together for the Nutcracker notes that said, think about efficiency. So if you think about degree of management from intrusive and chronic interventions to passive or singular, and then thinking about what do we know about the likely or ecological benefit. We can have some building temporary access roads. It's very intrusive and may actually have negative impacts. And some of these other options that we have maybe are more passive, more singular, have less of a degree of trammeling and have more ecological benefits. So think about the efficiencies with respect to management intervention, still valuing untrammeledness, but also considering the ecological benefit of action. So the last thing is this experiment, monitoring, adaptive management. One of the things that Greg's published on recently is this portfolio approach that let's not do the same thing everywhere. Let's set ourselves up so that 50 years from now, we've learned about what works, what doesn't. And so let's set up the landscape into these zones. Let's have restoration zones where let's go in and try to resist change and invest in restoring places. In other places, let's innovate. Let's anticipate what future conditions might be and do innovative management to a future range of variability. But let's do those things alongside of an observation zone where we let nature figure it out and let nature respond in the way it will so that we can learn from that reference. So we're very, very experimental in the way we do management. And then, this is a picture, this is like the required picture of my kids with the whitebark, is that I think, we want to pass on whitebark pine to our future generations, but we also want to pass on untrammeled, free-willed nature. So that dilemma is heavy on our hearts, and I think it's sort of, it's great to be here to talk a little bit about it, so thank you.
All right, I have that envied late afternoon slot that everyone always wants in a long day of meetings. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm Beth Hahn with the Leopold Institute, and I'm going to present this afternoon on a project that I've worked closely with my colleague Peter Landris on, and it's a generalized tool when you're approaching ecological intervention proposals in wilderness. So at the Leopold Institute, before I jump in here, I just wanted to provide a little bit more context for this project. So for many years, we've been getting project-level requests from field wilderness managers asking for help on this issue. And so this tool was an attempt to really try to create a more standalone, systematic approach to these kind of questions, including whitebark. Let's see. Spin it around? Okay, there we go. Operator error. Gotcha. Okay, so to start off, I first wanted to present a little bit of data on this general issue of how much ecological intervention occurs in wilderness. So currently, there is not a database that we can go to, an interagency database to say how much action is out there, where did it happen, was it successful in its goals. And so we worked with master's student, Lucy Lieberman, to try to get at these data. And so she implemented a statistically robust survey about a year ago. Some of you may have received it. And she was trying to get a sense of what were the frequency of ecological interventions in wilderness for a 5-year period, 2011 to 15, and what were those types of activities that were implemented. So ultimately, what she found is that 37% of the responding wilderness units had implemented some kind of intervention. And across those different intervention activities, about half of them, 46%, were vegetation interventions. So probably a quick follow-up question would be how many of those were whitebark? I tried to reach Lucy. I couldn't quite get in touch with her. I know the bulk of these are invasive species treatments. You know, there might be one or two, but I wouldn't suspect that this number would be a real high number for whitebark pine, but I could certainly follow up on that. But just to give you a flavor for the kinds of work that is happening in wilderness out there, some people think there's absolutely no ecological intervention. This was sort of our first attempt to really get a systematic look at the kinds of activities that are happening. So I won't spend a lot of time here. Becky and Travis sort of touched on this fundamental issue of balancing different qualities of wilderness character. So clearly when we're thinking about ecological intervention, it's most often trading off the notion of untrammeled wilderness versus sort of a natural wilderness. And so what I want to tell you about today is a tool that Peter and I have developed in collaboration with a working group that started about 3.5 years ago. Peter and I gathered up a bunch of information from the project level requests from wilderness managers. We looked at the literature that was out there and really tried to pull together our first attempt at a tool to support these kinds of decisions. So we brought together an interagency team here to Missoula in March of 2014. We gnashed our teeth, our sort of collective teeth for 3 days. And then we went out and pilot tested our revised draft of the tool with 16 wilderness units. So we looked for a good mix of ecological interventions, regions, agencies. It included Region 6, so I spent some time with folks out at the Portland office looking at whitebark pine in the sort of Pasayten project. And then we took the feedback from those pilot tests and we revised the tool again, sent it out for review, and fairly recently have released the final version. So I'm gonna show you that today, or parts of it anyway. There won't be time to go into all the details. But really what we're looking for with this tool is a standalone tool that helps to improve the decision-making process as well as the decision. And what I mean by that is we wanted to produce something that was comprehensive and systematic. So a lot of times in natural resource tools, we see the ecological only represented. And because this is such a contentious issue in wilderness, we really wanted to pull in explicit consideration of law and policy, as well as values and ethics very early into the conversation so that areas of uncertainty could be highlighted, areas of potential conflict could be thought about at an early stage, to really try to ensure a more successful outcome. We wanted the tool to apply to all 4 wilderness agencies, all areas of the country, all sizes of wilderness, from a couple acres to 8 million plus. But we also wanted this tool to be locally flexible. So we recognize that a whitebark pine proposal in the Pasayten might look very different from a whitebark pine proposal in the Grand Tetons. And we wanted to allow for flexibility for the decision maker. And then finally, we were looking for a tool that would improve communication inside the agencies. So a lot of times those project level calls we would field at the Leopold Institute would be someone in a panic, and they'd say, oh, my colleagues, they've developed this proposal with their state agency colleague, and they want to go forward, and they have the proposal, and I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to interact on it, and they don't know much about wilderness. How do I facilitate this conversation? So we were looking for a tool that would help to bring together those different disciplinary perspectives in sort of one package, and hopefully, improve that communication internally. And then ultimately, as these projects are implemented or not, those rationale would be captured for the public and for external stakeholder groups as well. So we'll jump into the tool quickly, I promise. This is a lot of lead in. But these were the kinds of things we were trying to build into the tool. And hopefully it explains some of the teeth gnashing that I mentioned earlier. So in thinking about wilderness, we wanted to avoid the action bias. So don't just, I think all wilderness professionals recognize that whitebark pine is a huge issue for wilderness management. So really think hard about if action is necessary before we rush to action. Be wary of oversimplification. So really think about the different trade-offs at work. So not just the ecological trade-offs, those wilderness character trade-offs, values and ethics of different stakeholders. That's a key component of wilderness intervention decisions. Laws and policy. So Endangered Species Act, Wilderness Act, great example here. And again, I mentioned this earlier, one size does not fit all. So trying to bring together these different elements moving forward. And then finally, underscoring again this notion of interdisciplinary engagement as early as possible. So this is meant to support the pre-decisional, sort of pre-NEPA phase of proposal development. But we know in several instances it's been used to refine projects that are well into the NEPA stage. We developed this tool to be what we call value neutral. So it's not biased for or against interventions, but rather it's meant to elicit the assumptions, the uncertainties, the data that are used in ultimately making a decision to move forward or not. It's meant to be a voluntary tool. And then finally, again, it doesn't guarantee consistent decisions across the whole wilderness preservation system. And that's fine. We didn't mean it to be. So it's essentially a table with, it's a tool with 3 different tables. The first table focuses on ecological considerations. So what is the degradation and what is the proposed intervention? The second table really focuses on effects of the intervention on wilderness character and relationships with stakeholder values, whatever that spectrum of values might be. And then the final table elicits information on the relevant law, regulatory, administrative considerations, case law, those kind of things. So it tries to really bundle all that together. So again, I'm not going to go into all of this detail, but I wanted to give you a flavor for what this tool looks like, and happy to share by email the full version. So in Table A, what is the ecological degradation and what is the proposed ecological intervention? We're asking for, probably the kinds of stuff you are already putting in your whitebark pine proposals. But this is just trying to provide it to ask these questions in a standardized format. So questions about ecological context, ecological effects, and I'll point out in particular for ecological effects, that's for both not intervening as well as intervening, so really taking that hard look in both directions. Questions about the intervention scope and scale, so what are you hoping to implement and what does that look like? And then uncertainties. So again, this is probably pretty familiar territory for a lot of you, but rounding it up in one place. So taking a closer look, if we dive into ecological context, asking about historic background, asking about things like past human actions, legacy land use effects, range of historic variation. Travis mentioned that with some of his modeling. Thinking about historic distribution and rate of spread for the degradation, as well as the threats and risks. So really just trying to prompt that ID team to think about these things early and disclose these. Maybe you don't know. It's good to know where your uncertainties lie. So moving to current status, so kind of a variation on what we just discussed. What is the current status of the ecological degradation? Is the source local to the wilderness? Is it regional? Is it global? Are current human actions preventing natural ecological recovery? Is there an urgent ecological need to intervene? So that's a quick look at two elements from ecological context. That first one. So if we switch to the next table, this focuses more on the wilderness character and stakeholder values elements. So a classic question for whitebark pine, Travis raised it. Why here, why now? Have you considered outside of wilderness? And you know, that's always going to come up with ecological intervention projects in wilderness, so being prepared to answer that. Another key question would be, if you are planning to intervene outside of wilderness, is the expected or anticipated effect meant to change wilderness character inside those boundaries? So a real typical example here would be if someone is trying to, if a unit is trying to reintroduce an extirpated wildlife species, they typically will, oftentimes will reintroduce that species outside the boundary with the full expectation that it would disperse there. And then this final question, is the proposed intervention experimental? Is it a well-established practice? Has it been done elsewhere in wilderness? So really trying to make the case for the context of either inside or outside of wilderness. And then I'll highlight the question about stakeholders because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times natural resource decision frameworks tend to focus just on the natural resource, and we've found that early consideration of stakeholder values for these projects are really important. Those are often the ones that will trip up a project. And so just reminding an ID team early in the proposal development stage to think about who are your likely stakeholders. It might be a pretty sleepy wilderness. There are plenty of those out there. It might be a really high-profile wilderness. And so being aware of that, really having at least an early understanding of what the likely views and reactions to a proposal might look like. And then what is the basis for your understanding of those values? So trying to highlight those considerations at an early stage. And then the final table is Table C. So this really points to a series of questions related to legal considerations. So what is the relevant wilderness legislation for the area or set of areas that you're looking at? Other laws, Endangered Species Act, case law. So are there any judicial rulings that apply to your area or that particular decision? Who has the administrative jurisdiction? So depending on which wilderness agency you're working for, that will vary. Sometimes it'll go all the way up to high-level regional or national level signatures. Sometimes it's lower. So being clear on who's signing the decision document early can really make a big difference. Do you need to consult? Do you need to talk to tribes in the area? Do you need to work with Fish and Wildlife Service? And then agency direction. So is there agency direction in place for what you're proposing to do? So that's a really quick look at a longer tool, but really what we're trying to do here is ask a set of questions. So we heard earlier about the survey results about should we intervene in wilderness, and I forget exactly what the percentage was. 80+% of respondents said we should intervene in wilderness. So I think that's a good starting question. But I think if you're going to be successful in implementing those projects, you really need to look at, and I assume you all do too, but what we're really trying to do here with this tool is help to provide support to these kinds of projects to think through what our group and what pilot testers and reviewers thought were kind of essential considerations if you're going to move forward. So, and finally, I just want to acknowledge a lot of people were involved with this project, and happy to engage with you all here and take your questions with the rest.
We're putting you in the hot seats now, guys. Head over there. It's now less awkward if you go up there, yes. Any questions or comments? Yeah, Rob, we'll start with you, and Eliza's got the microphone. We're doing a whole old school talk show. Then I'm going to take this.
Okay, test, yeah. So the first presentation, I liked the bouncing ball thing, and I've been known to put metaphors in a wearing blender and hit puree, but I was having trouble fitting in the extinction issue with your X and Y axes. You know, the X and Y's in and of themselves were fine, but what if the threat is that the dot is going to fall off the edge, or it's in a whole nother layer? I got the sense of how to do. I got the sense of how to value. On the second presentation, I got it, but the first presentation, I was, you know, we're not dealing with trammelness and pristineness. We're dealing with extinction if we don't do something. That's the question.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how to answer it. I mean, it is a metaphor, you're right, and so you can only take it so far. I mean, I would say that an extinction of a species within an ecosystem is pushing it into novel, pushing it sort of along the x-axis back towards the left, and so, you know, I mean, you can imagine, and I think Michael Scott does this well, where he takes species that are listed and talks about what kind of intervention does it require to keep that species from going extinct. Everything from like bringing them into zoos and captive breeding to chelating condors' blood, and there's a lot of intervention that's required to maintain species, and there's a grading of that. So I think, you know, I haven't presented that question. I don't know that Greg has either, but I think that, you know, if we wanted to make the metaphor work, we could try, but just as you started out, it's a metaphor, but I would say that you could think through for a species, how much intervention does it require to keep it around? I'm sure that's probably that's not satisfying, but that's how I respond, because that's how I'm thinking right now.
If it works, I should just shout. We'll see. Okay, so sort of building on what Rob said, one thing in your climate change modeling, and I did like your article in Nutcracker Notes, the fact is that whitebark in some places is so bad that if wilderness is your only refuge, if that's the only place that whitebark's going to be, there isn't regeneration that's going to move it up into that wilderness refuge. And so it does dovetail a bit on what Rob is saying, and that leads to, because of within wilderness, you're not helping it regenerate to stay alive in wilderness and to survive, or to be able to move up slope, then into wilderness. Of course, we can help that outside of wilderness, but that spells it's the death knell of whitebark unless we do some action. Okay, So some of this probably fits into Beth's framework there that would, allow us perhaps to think about some action. So.
Can I say one thing on that? Because one of the things that three-zone, the portfolio approach that Greg's laid out, recognizes those sorts of things and suggests that those zones be applied along elevational bands for things like that, so that it's not, you're taking into consideration sort of those migrations that are going to be required to occur. So we may want to take things like that into consideration. and just say that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up on one thing. In thinking about all sorts of different types of ecological intervention activities in wilderness, one thing that strikes me about whitebark pine is there's an enormous amount of data, and there's an enormous amount of, as you all know, all these different strategies at different scales across the range. And so it's both a blessing and a curse. And so it's like you can create a very compelling case for moving forward where you do, but it's also, there's an enormous amount of data and how to sort through it and how to make that pitch for moving forward. It seems like in some of the projects that I've seen, it seems like that's a little bit of a struggle sometimes, is how to make sense of it all and how to make that pitch. Now again, I've seen a snapshot of these projects that might not be an accurate representation, but yeah, just it puts you in a very interesting position relative to some other kind of wilderness management choices.
So my question is for you, Beth. Did that just go out? The survey results, 82% of the respondents said that we should be doing restoration of wilderness. So that to me is kind of a value-laden answer. That's an opinion thing. And you caution about action bias. Is restoration in wilderness necessary? But I think that's also, it depends who's answering that question. And so I guess my question for you is, with this tool, who is it that would be providing the answers to the questions in each of those tables? And are the questions presented in such a way that it removes that value-laden bias? So regardless of your personal opinion, you could ask two different people, well, is restoration necessary? And I think, some people might say yes, some people might say no.
Yeah, good comments. So the questions, I think, are presented in a pretty value-neutral way. It's the reason why we try to emphasize that action bias piece, in part, is because a lot of people working, some people working in wilderness are not necessarily aware of the kind of legal construct or that additional legal framework there. And so we try to present that to make sure it's understood, but then also to make sure that that people are considering both not intervening relative to intervening, because a lot of times what we just see is just the intervention options without that clear consideration. And that sometimes in the past is where people get tripped up sort of in, kind of in the court of public opinion or in actual courts. So just making sure that it's meant as a prompt rather than a thou shall not, if that makes sense.
Since our second mic is acting up, could you repeat questions?
Oh, sure.
No, I don't need to do it now.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, Beth, I'm really looking forward to seeing that tool, and I had some contact with you during the Satan project, so I was the IDT lead on that one, and of course the decision was not to act in that Cuban region. Now most of the Satan burned this summer, so we'll be going back in and looking at those areas again. And sometime in the not too distant future, I am looking forward to being in contact with you again.
Sure. Yeah, happy to work with you. And we actually worked on a similar project where people were looking, an agency was looking at putting bull trout in an area where they weren't currently. So it's in somewhat an analogous position. We have a listed species looking at a climate refugia spot. So So we're happy to work with individual managers, certainly.
Happy to talk further.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Yes, go ahead.
So just one thing that I think is, I don't know, important to recognize with surveys or forms like this where you have tables with lots of really detailed information, and I think it is providing an opportunity to really flesh out some of these decision tools. But a lot of the people who I've been working with when I'm trying to help walk through MRAs or these different forms, this will be their first exposure to the concept of wilderness or to filling out a research application. And one thing that I've encountered is that these MRAs have turned into really large documents that can be quite daunting. And I just wonder how we balance that need to try to really delve into these ideas, but also kind of putting up these barriers to people who are really trying to help build our knowledge.
Sure, and that's a great comment. You know, we really meant this tool to serve at the early proposal development stage, so our vision was not that this would be full of citations, you know, a 600-page document or anything like that. I mean, really what we're thinking is get the thoughts down. You know, maybe this is a paragraph or two for each of these to sort of get down the initial thoughts on whether or not we have information, whether we have relevant data or models or on-the-ground empirical data to bring to the proposal development as a way to understand where are we starting from zero, where do we need to contact Travis or Bob Keene or whoever else is in this room to round up our information sources, really to highlight those sort of gaps, really to put into context, here's my project area, here's where it fits into the regional strategy or the range-wide strategy, here's what it means relative to what we think climate might do. Has anyone talked to Wilderness Watch? Has anyone talked to the regional forester? Has it, you know, sort of what are those kinds of things that are going to be inherent to every project? So I think your point is super valid. We don't want to create an early analytical burden, but we also don't want to wait too long. And so to try to get people to think at an earlier stage is asking for a bit of a paradigm shift at the project level, but given the fact that these projects are pretty contentious, I think it's a smart one to consider. Yeah, I know that might not be entirely satisfactory.
Any other questions or thoughts? We got the back first.
Who has the authority to run this tool?
Well, it's designed as a voluntary tool, so it's sort of, you know, our sort of original team's vision was that this would be an interdisciplinary team's tool, and that we would want decision maker engagement to sort of look over, you know, the ID team lead would brief the decision maker, here's where we are, what do you think needs further attention or data collection or connection with researchers? But it's really meant to be at that local unit level ID team for deciding how much information is enough, what do we need to do more.
Okay, so my question is, let's say a project is proposed and it actually has minimal impact and it's actually given a nod. What if there are 25 other projects that are exactly like it? Do you have to get each one approved? And if you're dealing with all the same variables, is there a way that it could be umbrella? And it's something really important to think about with Whitebark pine restoration in a given region with conditions that are similar across the region, using your tool. And, you know, if you can show that every one of these projects are just in slightly different geographic areas within a core area, do we really have to go to that? I don't expect you even perhaps to be able to answer this because you can't. I'm just throwing this question out there, hypothetically.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there are programmatic decisions, which is essentially what you're talking about. So they're out there. as you might guess, it's a big lift to make happen, but there are programmatic decisions.
There's somebody in this room that knows this a lot better than me, but at least within a particular region, they have done project EAs, not EISs, like a southern pine beetle cut and move on a forest. If the project is like this, with these kind of parameters, there's a blanket approval. So anybody, we have done this in the Forest Service, but I'm 2 years away, so.
Lately, there's now that's forgotten.
With Astro, well, it can be done within a region.
Any other thoughts, comments? Great, thank you both, really appreciate it.